In this WordPress tutorial, we will learn about widgets. So let's answer 3 questions. 1, what is a widget? 2, how do I manage widgets from the WordPress admin area? And 3, if I'm creating a theme, how do I make sure that that theme supports widgets or is ready to accept widgets? So we'll start with number 1, what is a widget? A widget is simply a self-contained chunk of content that usually has a very specific purpose that gets displayed on a website. So for example, a lot of websites have a sidebar. And in that sidebar, we may see an area named Recent Posts and then a list of links. That is a Recent Posts widget. Or we might see an area labeled Categories and then a list of links. That is a Categories widget. So now that we have a general idea of what a widget is, let's head over to the WordPress admin area and add our first widget to a website. In the admin sidebar, look for the appearance link, then look for the sublink named Widgets. In this left column, we see the available widgets that ship with WordPress out of the box. So this is the archives widget. It will output a monthly archive of our posts. This is the categories widget that we saw in the example earlier. Now in this right-hand column, we see the widget locations of the current theme that is enabled. So we see the first widget location is named Sidebar. And we can see that in our current demo theme, this is the sidebar and it's completely empty because we have not added any widgets yet. So let's add a widget. I will add the categories widget. So I click on it. It asks me which widget location do I want to add the categories widget to. I will select the sidebar. I will click save. So if we refresh our website, we see that the categories widget is now displaying in the sidebar. Let's head back to the WordPress admin area, and let's imagine that in addition to categories, I also want to output recent posts in the sidebar. So I can click on the recent posts widget, add it to the sidebar, and if we refresh, here it is. Now let's imagine that I decide I want this widget to display before the categories widget. It's as simple as dragging and dropping the recent post widget to sit above the categories. Now I must point out that widgets are not limited to the sidebar area of our website. So for example, back in the admin area, we can see that there are additional widget locations named footer area 1 through 4. So at the bottom of our website, we currently do not see any widgets, but let's add the search widget to the footer area 1 location. Here it is. So you can take advantage of any widget locations that your theme offers. So perhaps we want to add a bit of custom text to footer area 2. So I will click on the text widget. I will add it to footer area 2. I can now input any text that I want. Custom text here. This is a bit of custom text for footer area 2. Save. There you have it. We could also add monthly archives to footer area 3, and we could add meta links to footer area 4, even though I'm not sure how truly useful that is, but you get the idea. With just a bit of clicking and dragging and dropping, we just customized the sidebar of our website and the 4 columns in our footer. And it's very easy to drag and drop and modify. So perhaps we want to move these meta links to sit in the 3rd column. I can just drag and drop and switch things up however I like. All right, now let's change gears a bit. We are all familiar with what a widget is and how to manage widgets from the WordPress admin area. So we are now ready to dig into the real meat and potatoes of this lesson. If we are creating our own themes or modifying an existing theme, how do we add widget support? And how do we add widget locations anywhere that we please? Alright, so behind the scenes, I just removed all of the code in my theme that was adding widget support and was adding all of the widget locations. So you can see that this theme no longer has a sidebar. This is the exact code that we were working with in our previous lesson. So we should all be on the same page. We are going to write all of the code together. Let's get started. Our first step is to hollow out or carve out a bit of space for a sidebar. So the recipe to achieve this is just HTML and CSS. So we want two divs and we will float one to the left and one to the right. So all of this existing content we will wrap inside a div named main column. So in index.php, after the header, I'll drop out of PHP. We can drop back into PHP here, but we're going to create a new div with a class of main column. Now, right before the footer begins, we can close and open PHP accordingly. And I'm just going to cut and paste all of this code that is outputting the meat and potato guts of this page. I'm going to cut that into the main column div. And let's create a new div named secondary column. This will be our sidebar. So within this column, let's include a sample paragraph that reads, "This is the sidebar." Next, let's hop over to our style sheet and add a bit of CSS that corresponds with these new class names of secondary column and main column. So I will create a new comment to stay organized in our style.css file, main column. Select the main column class. We'll give it a width of 66% and we'll float it to the left. Let's create a comment for the side column. We'll select the secondary column class, give it a width of 30% and float it to the right. Now, if you've watched my lessons on CSS, you know that when we float columns, we need to clear our floats. Now, there are many different ways to clear a float, but my personal preference is to use the clear fix on a parent element so that our modules stay self-contained and can be easily moved around. So all I'm going to do is create a parent div. I will give it a name of site content, and I'm just going to cut and paste both the main column and the secondary column into this div. And then this newly created div will receive a second class of clearfix. So if we save index.php and if we save our style sheet, we see that from a layout perspective, our sidebar is in place. So now let's work towards making this a dynamic widget location. Whenever we are enabling a feature or making something dynamic, there's a good chance that we need to hop over to our functions.php file. At the bottom of our functions file, I'm going to create a comment to stay organized. Add our widget locations. So we need to write a function that adds a widget location for our sidebar. So we'll create a function. We can name it anything we would like, but I will name this our widgets initialize. Now we will write the guts of this function in just a moment, but first let's make sure that this function runs at just the right moment. So WordPress offers a function named add action. The first argument tells WordPress when to run this function. So we want to wait until the widgets initialize action, and then we just want to run this function. So the second argument is the name of the function that we're creating. So I'll just paste that in. Add a semicolon. So now we are free to write the guts of our function. So what do we want to do? We want to register a widget location. Register, only the name of the function we need to use is not register widget location, it's register sidebar. Now don't get too caught up on the name. This is a very flexible function that is not only used for sidebars. This function accepts many arguments, so we're actually going to create an array. So within this array, the first option is name. This is the name that end users in the WordPress admin area will see. So this is the widget location name. Or in other words, this name should be human friendly. So we can name this sidebar. Now the second option is named ID. Now end users will not see this. So this name doesn't need to be human friendly, it needs to be computer friendly. So that means no spaces or extra weird characters. So I will name this sidebar 1. Now this is all the code we need for the time being, but before I save this new code, let's head over to the WordPress dashboard, and you'll notice that when I hover over appearance, widgets is not an option. But as soon as we save this new code that we wrote, so Command S, if we come back to our dashboard and hover over appearance, widgets is an option. And you can see there is the one widget location, sidebar. Now currently, if we add a widget to our widget location, nothing will happen because we haven't updated our template or theme code. So for example, back in index.php, in our secondary column div, we still have static text which reads, "This is the sidebar." So we can simply replace this with a bit of PHP that will call in the appropriate widgets from the specific widget location that we choose. So we'll use the dynamic sidebar function. And this is where we use the ID that we just set up. So sidebar 1, save. And now this code in index.php will automatically pull in whatever we set up in the admin area. So if we want to add recent posts, add it to the sidebar, and we are in business. So this is excellent, except it's not the year 2004, and we don't only want widgets in our sidebar. Some websites don't even have a sidebar. But the great thing about WordPress is that it's very easy to add widget locations wherever we want to. So we could add a widget location in our header, we could add a widget location at the top of our content area, we can add widget locations in our footer. So to show you how easy it is to add additional widget locations, I'm going to add 4 widget locations in the footer. So 4 columns. In functions.php, we can simply duplicate this register sidebar code. So the name of our new location will be footer area 1, and we'll give it an ID of footer 1. You could use any name and ID values that you choose. So with this code in place, if we revisit the widget screen in the WordPress admin area, we see a new widget location named footer area 1. Now if I attempt to add the search widget to footer area 1, if we refresh our website, nothing will happen because we have not yet output the code in footer.php. So I will create a new div with a class of footer widgets. And let's use PHP to output the widget area that has an ID of footer 1. So if we save and refresh, there is our widget location. So that's 1 footer widget area down. Let's create an additional 3. So over in functions.php, we simply need to register additional widget locations. So we can duplicate this again, change the name to area 2 and the ID to footer 2. Duplicate it again, footer area 3, an ID of 3, and once again, footer area 4 with an ID of 4. So if we revisit the widget screen, we now have all 4 widget locations. Now before we add any fun widgets to any of these new locations, let's first output these locations in footer.php. So here is the footer 1 location. I actually want to wrap each of these footer locations in a div that uses a class of footer widget area, so that we can use CSS to target this class name later to create the 4 columns effect or 4 columns layout. Now before I duplicate this an additional 3 times for the 2, 3, and 4 areas, I want to show you a neat trick. So if an end user in the admin area doesn't add any widgets to a particular location, we shouldn't output this code in the browser. It's a waste of markup. So we can use a bit of conditional logic and say only if a widget area is active. So we can use the isActive sidebar function. The argument will be the name of this widget area, so footer 1. So we're saying only if there are actually widgets assigned to this widget location do we want to output any of this. So then we will close our if statement, and if. Let's indent this to stay organized. So now we can simply duplicate this an additional 3 times for all 4 of our locations. Alright, so behind the scenes I just finished copying and pasting this code and then plugging in the appropriate numbers, so 2, 2, 3, 3, and 4, 4. So now we are free to add different widgets to these locations. So we can add archives to footer area 2, and we can add meta links to footer area 3, and we can add custom text to footer area 4, custom text for area 4. Hooray. So if we save and then refresh in the browser, we see that all that is missing now is a bit of CSS to position these areas so that they sit as if they are 4 distinct columns. So in footer PHP, you can see that we gave each column area a class of footer widget area, and we're going to be floating these in just a second, so I want to make sure that their parent element has a class of clear fix. So let's head over to our style sheet, create a new comment, footer widget areas. Now our columns had a class of footer widget area. I want 4 of these to sit on a row, so I will give them a width of 25%. I will float them to the left, and I want them to have margin or spacing between the 4 columns. So I will give them a bit of padding right, and to counteract this so that our width-based arithmetic still makes sense, I'm going to use box sizing border box. Now, obviously, from a graphic design standpoint, there's still a lot of work to be done. But you now have the tools to create widget areas and register them within your themes. And you don't need to limit yourself to the sidebar or the footer. You can use the dynamic sidebar function to output widget locations anywhere in any of your theme files. Maybe you want a widget location at the end of each blog post. Maybe you want a widget location that only displays in a special page template. It's up to you. You can create as many locations as you want. Now, before we close out this lesson, there are 2 more tips that I want to share. Number 1 is that if you're interested in customizing the HTML that WordPress outputs for your widgets, there are a few simple options that you can add in functions.php. So for example, by default, WordPress treats widget areas as a giant unordered list. So that's why we see a bullet even for the widget titles. Now we can use CSS to hide the bullets, or we can simply change the HTML output. So for example, if I inspect this header, we can see that it lives inside a list item. This is the categories widget. And if I hover over this list item, you can see that it's highlighting the recent posts widget. So we can customize that. If you don't want to live with the unordered list item structure, you don't need to. So in functions.php, we can add additional options for this widget location. So I will say before widget, output a bit of HTML that reads div class widget item. And we'll use a different option named after widget, and we will simply say close that div. So now if we save and refresh, WordPress is using the custom HTML structure that we just specified. So now we can see this widget is using a div with the class of widget item, and so is recent posts. So this way you are free to add any border or margin between the widgets. You can write CSS that targets HTML that you are comfortable with. Just a quick note, you also don't have to live with the fact that by default, WordPress outputs the title of widgets as an H2 with a class of widget title. So maybe you want to use an H4 element. To do that, in functions.php, you can simply say before title, H4 with a class of my special class. So you can use whatever you feel like. And then be sure to add the after title, and then close out whatever element you just opened. So now our sidebar uses H4 elements. And this lesson's final tip is that the output for our sidebar, which lives in index.php, secondary column, this code should actually live in its own file named sidebar.php. So that way we don't repeat ourselves. So I will create a new file in my theme folder named sidebar.php. I will cut this secondary column code and paste it into the newly created sidebar.php. And then where this code used to live in index.php, I can simply say git sidebar. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close.